Okay, today we'll be covering ethyl benzene, its permissible exposure limits, its threshold limit value, recommended exposure level, and time-weighted averages. There's a lot of information on this chemical, and there's many agencies that provide these recommendations for threshold. So, ethyl benzene exposure, everybody is exposed on a regular basis. It occurs naturally and is used in very large quantities to make other chemicals that are used to make plastics, resins, nylon, and synthetic fibers. It is present in crude oil, gasoline, and cigarette smoke, so anytime you go to the pump, part of what you're smelling is benzene. Inhalation exposure may occur with this product when using products such as glues, paints, furniture waxes, and detergents. Exposure from food, beverages, and drinking water is not as high as exposure through the air. It's also not as common. Some of the major health effects of ethyl benzene: short-term exposure to high levels in the air can result in drowsiness, dizziness, rapid heart rate, headaches, tremors, confusion, and unconsciousness. At very high levels, it can cause death. Eating foods or drinking liquids containing high levels of benzene can cause vomiting, stomach irritation, dizziness, sleepiness, convulsion, rapid heart rate, coma, and at high levels, again, it can cause death. Long-term exposure, the major effects are on the blood, hemopoietic. All right, benzene can cause harmful health effects on bone marrow, a decrease in red blood cells, cells leading to anemia, affect the immune system, and increase the chance for infection. Exposure over long term can cause leukemia, which is a type of cancer that affects the white blood cells. OSHA sets a permissible exposure limit, or PEL, at 100 parts per million. This also has a TWA, or time-weighted average. So when you add up your exposure limits for the day and then divide by the time, even though you might have been exposed to more than 100 parts per million, that time-weighted average cannot exceed 100 parts per million for the day. So OSHA's recommendation limit is 100 parts per million with a time-weighted average not to exceed 100 parts, or 100 parts per million throughout the day. The National Health Institute for Occupational Safety recommended exposure limit, or REL, is 100 parts per million, and it's also a time-weighted average. But they also offer a short-term exposure limit of 125 parts per million, not to exceed the time-weighted average of 100 parts per million. If you're going to go off of the short-term exposure limit of 125 parts per million, exposure cannot exceed 15 minutes. All right, no more than 4 short-term exposure limits per shift, and there must be a 60-minute period where no exposure occurs between each short-term exposure limit. Again, these short-term exposure limits are not to exceed the time-weighted average of 100 parts per million. American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, these are professionals working in the field, have come up with a threshold limit value. These are conditions which they believe repeated exposure will cause no adverse health effects, right? And that limit is 20 parts per million. So this would be 20 parts per million day in and day out, not to exceed the time-weighted average, that they believe no adverse health effects would be experienced by the person being exposed. Ethyl benzene, OSHA recommends medical surveillance, all right, medical exams. This would be continued monitoring for anybody that may be exposed to benzene at or above the action level of 30 or more days per year. 2, may be exposed to benzene at or above the permissible exposure limit, 10 or more days per year. Has been exposed to more than 10 parts per million of benzene for 30 or more days and a year prior to December 10th, 1997, or who are involved in tire building operations or tire building machine operators and use solvents containing more than 0.1% benzene. Employee health must be documented periodically so that a physician can determine whether or not employees have experienced adverse health effects, and if so, the extent to which these effects were caused by their exposure. This is just a brief oversight of ethyl benzene and some of the governing bodies and professional organizations that make recommendations on exposure limits. these are some of the sources where this information was gleaned from. All right, thank you for your time.